adjust. Very good. Thank you, David.
Good evening. I'm David Pines. I am the co-organizer of Physics 150, Chemistry 298, Gateways to Emergent Behavior in Science and Society. And we, together with our Dean Winston Coe and our Provost Ralph Hexter, are sponsoring this series of distinguished lectures. Next week's lecturer will be Professor Sue Kiefer from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and she's going to talk, I've forgotten her exact title, but it's something like emergent, it's not quite emergent disasters, but it's quite close to that.
Stealth disasters.
Stealth disasters.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of a contradiction?
She's a spectacularly good geologist, and she's thought hard about issues of natural storms, disasters, and looks at it from the long-time perspective of somebody who's studied the Earth as an emergent object some 3.5 billion years ago. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Pete Smerud with us. Pete has a not formal background, which is totally suitable for the director of a non-formal educational center, an environmental learning center. He began life as an undergraduate, majoring in biology, chemistry, and German, and then quickly spent a year or so as an outdoor adventure guide, and could see that this was a pretty spectacular way of exploring the outdoors, but that unlike his fellow guides, he was pretty fascinated by what he was looking at, not just the experience of being out there in 30 below zero weather, zinging along on his snowshoes, or cutting holes in the ice to go ice fishing, or you name it, or exploring caves, which he was telling us about over dinner the other night. He found his way to the Wolf Ridge Environmental Learning Center, which is one of the oldest such centers in the US. They all came out of Earth Day in 1969, which is before I think any of you were born, or pretty nearly so. And Wolf Ridge, as you will learn from Pete, is really quite special. Not least because, as you will shortly hear, something like 500,000 kids have been part of the Wolf Ridge learning experience. So he has a lot to tell us about gateways to environmental education. Pete.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, and to Ralph, whom I've never met, nor the Dean, Winston. But it's a pleasure. When I left home a couple days ago, it was 2 degrees. That would be above zero, which is not a given at this time of year. And as he mentioned, it's winter camping. Just about 15 years ago, a couple of buddies and I were sitting around. There might have been a few beers involved, and we were watching the news, and the forecast was for February 6th. It was the evening, so very close to this time period. And the weather forecaster came on and said, "We're forecasting this will be the record lowest temperature ever in Minnesota this evening." And of course, what did we do? Turn to each other. We need to go camping. And so that evening, we trucked out into the woods, dug a pit in the snow, and we didn't experience the record cold. It was only minus 57 that night. It was a glorious evening. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was toasty warm and actually was late for work the next morning at Wolf Ridge as I had overslept. As David mentioned, I run a large nonprofit accredited school that is anything but formal, and that my interest in coming there from working as a mountain guide, but also being trained as a biologist, was to find the partnership between the two. I had no idea back in the 80s when I was completing college that what I was doing was likely a future that would someday be called a major in environmental studies, and now is one of the highest declared majors around the country for a lot of young people. That it's been a glorious ride for me, and so I'm here this evening to share what I feel is the need and the value of understanding emergent behavior, not so much for science particularly, but for humanity. And there is nothing more emergent than, I will tell you later, than putting a group of 7th grade boys together and telling them they need to start a fire and get hot water going or they will die. And that it is quite humorous, and you get to, it is a completely unpredictable sum of the whole as you begin to envision something like that. I will give you lots of images tonight, very few words on the screen. I hope I have a tremendous number of stories that can yield lots of questions as we complete the evening. But to start off, rather than me telling you what I do or giving you that context, I want to show you what I do and give you that context.
Poor old granddad
Many of those slides were very much non-science education. The difference between environmental education and science education is distinctive. And you will see in a theme this evening that I will push for, that David and I and a number of other people have been talking about in the past few days, is the importance and the crucial need that society embrace the fact that science education needs to involve people at a more greater level. That the science literacy issues in this country in large part stem from the fact that science is good and science is important, but if we can't create a populace that knows how to communicate effectively with each other, to cooperatively problem solve, to achieve for a greater good of all of us, that those skills of interpersonal dynamics within our community is where environmental ed brings in that aspect. And science ed can do, and often does, depending on the instructor, and yet grad standards and things like that throughout the country often don't necessarily address that component. We'll talk a little bit later about task management skills and things that, depending on the political football that is sometimes thrown around that can be grad standards, of some values that people have had for that. We have thousands of children from all over the upper Midwest that spend typically a week with us during the school year. But we've had students from as far west as Monterey, California, from as far south as Dallas, from as far east as Boston. We are in the very northeastern portion of Minnesota. I'm almost 5 hours north of Minneapolis. So people probably have that as a good reference. We are much closer to Canada than we are to anything else as far as another border. And that the predominant attendants in our science education or environmental education programs are students out of the Twin Cities, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, but also North Dakota, Wisconsin, all over Minnesota, and of course in some cases for affluent schools that are coming from a great distance away. It's mostly public schools, and it's a large facility. Steve Hartzog has been there. Sean Carlson, who spoke the other night, has been there. They can tell you as well. It's a 380-bed facility that loads of buses on Monday at noon arrive and unload children, and there are 15,000 kids approximately a year that come through us. We've been in existence since '71. That's over 500,000 children that have come. That translates to about 18 million hours of instruction. It is now incredibly common that every week of the year, the parent chaperones that attend with the group are people who they themselves came as a 5th or 6th grader. That's from whom I've learned a lot of these lessons, because they can come back and tell me that what was most crucial to their existence and their connections to the outdoors and the environment was to have authentic settings for learning. That's what we do. We take people and we put them in what some parents might say horrific conditions. That this could be a miserable occurrence for some, and yet we all know, you know this, our society is tremendously urbanizing. The people who live on farms, the people that log in the forests, that those connections are being lost very quickly. And you all are at this transitional period right now in society's history where that is occurring at a very rapid rate and without a lack of connection to the outdoors, an immersion in the outdoors. These students are learning about stratification of water in a body in a lake by being in the water. They can begin to understand that water density changes, or it changes its position, that in the summertime, their feet, of course, right now are a bit colder than their upper bodies, and that can affect oxygen levels and things like that that relate to the fish that can live in certain habitats within that microclimate of that lake. And that by providing these authentic settings for students, that not only do they learn, but they have application and connection. Wolf Ridge was founded by 3 school teachers. It was 1969, first Earth Day had occurred, and a social studies teacher and 2 science teachers were getting hassled. Their principal and the superintendent, what are you doing? Why are you taking those kids down to that abandoned lot down the street? Well, it's got all this great grass. It's full of meadow voles. It's a great study in population dynamics. We're learning about small mammal ecology, the critical element of where in the food chain they're understanding where vegetation is turned into meat. It's amazing. You will not go back to that lot. Education is in the classroom, sitting at a desk, watching a film strip, reading a book. And remember, this is 1969. And they wrote a grant to the state of Minnesota for $275,000 for 3 years, and from 71 to 74, they had about 30 schools a year that came. Well, the whole intent was to immerse those students to see, touch, smell, feel all the things that they may read about back in their school. That the connection element that we're trying to achieve is classically emergent behavior, because we can't predict what will come. Your grandparents never in a million years could predict what you're dealing with right now in the environment. You have no ability to predict what your children will be managing and dealing with. We can take stabs at it. The only thing that we can know for sure is that change will come, and it's happening fast, and understanding emergence is pretty critical to that idea. How many in here, raise your hand, went to camp as a kid? Wow, that's stellar. Turn to the person next to you and tell them very quickly, just a minute or two story. What do you remember? What was valuable to you? Go, right now. Don't think, just go. One person should be finishing up. You should be quick trading places here with storytelling. And you should be finishing up. Well, that was quick. Curious if anyone, raise your hand if you heard a really kind of fun story. You go, that's awesome. Anybody? Oh, come on. Willing to share? You tell me what he just told you.
Oh, well, so at his camp, he went to a frozen river. We live in San Diego, and rivers don't freeze over that often, so ice is kind of fascinating to us, and he could pick up the top layer, and it was a sheet, and that was really cool. Break it.
How long ago? How long ago was that?
6 years.
Okay. Other people? Another couple quick stories? Anybody? Come on. How many people remember coming back from camp and going, that was awesome. I loved that. And you got back home and it was different, wasn't it? It was sort of that longing of, oh, I have my camp friends, but then I got to come back to reality. The concept of summer camp really is in many ways what we've done. We've turned it into a school. And yet we've made it academic. There's graduation standards associated with the curriculum that the students experience, but the conceptual framework is very much the same. You are immersed no differently by finding the frozen river with elements of discovery and the cool lake ice. And you may not remember much about it, but I remember the experience. And that connection, that is classic environmental education, and yet the act of just dropping somebody in and letting them experience that is good education. Often provides values development. But to make it even stronger is you put a teacher with that, and a teacher who can facilitate that sort of experience. That now you've achieved what really is, in that sense, environmental education. That I'll reference a little bit later as well. Anyone ever heard the name Richard Louv? Recently published author. He wrote a book a few years ago called Last Child in the Woods. He coined the term that children of this current society are suffering from, quote unquote, nature deficit disorder. He then linked to that deficit and that lack of exposure and connection through research and data collection, evidence of increased levels of areas where students have lack of connection to nature of ADHD and ADD. Now, of course, you can manipulate statistics in many ways, And yet we can all agree, when I was a child, I was locked out of the house. Mom, let me in. Get outside. Stay outside. Don't come in until it's dark. And then by the time it got dark, did I want to come in? No, it was adult dark. It wasn't kid dark. It was adult. If it was dark if you were inside looking out, but it wasn't really dark yet. And I'd battle and not want to come in. That the concept of connecting people to nature is age-old. It's been going on for years, but now it's been developed in what is really a relatively new industry. That growing out of Earth Day, you couldn't get an undergraduate degree in environmental ed. These happen to be students from Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota who were up with us for a week. That it wasn't until the mid-90s when you saw the first undergraduate degrees appear. By the late 90s, the first master's degrees were appearing. Now you can get doctoral degrees in environmental ed. But in the 80s, none of that existed. You might have been a field biologist with a leaning towards education. And yet, the advantage of my time there is I've been watching not only kids come, but as well we run a graduate school program and undergrad programs. And so every year we welcome in 16 to 20 new undergrad and grad students, primarily grad students. They spend the year with us teaching as well as learning. They're getting natural science, physical science education, and they are as well then doing a great deal of the teaching and developing skills that make them marketable professionals in this field. On the West Coast here, I currently have people teaching at Yosemite Institute. The education director for the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry is a grad from the program. Those people are going out to then lead the fields of environmental education in other capacities. And you might think, well, you know, those are the people who went to camp and they loved it and their parents did this and et cetera, et cetera. And all true back in the day when many of those kids grew up hunting, fishing, camping, farms, big gardens. But even in this case, in the last 25 years, I've been able to watch those young people come to me. And now in our graduate coursework, we have to have seminars in winter camping. We have to have seminars in sea kayaking and rock climbing. 25 years ago, on Monday morning staff meetings, you heard all the idiot stories of what had occurred over the weekend where people almost died because they were out gaining judgment skills, leadership skills on their own. Their parents took them out. Their parents kicked them out and said, take the car and the tent and go camping for the weekend. That doesn't fly much anymore. And so now that sort of training has changed, and even we've seen that change. People like Jillian arrive tremendously committed. They care desperately about the environment. They care desperately about sustainability. This is my future I'm dealing with. I want things to be done properly, and yet even those folks, I can tell you distinctly, are lacking authentic experience compared to what society had a while ago. Now, for people that are in Steve Hartzog's class, it may be, yeah, that's nice, but I'm not here to take my children and put them in the mud and put them in the lake and take them canoeing and out in the snow and et cetera. How can I make things authentic that you likely remember your best teachers? Who are the teachers in school that you go, oh, for me, Mr. Lallam was his name in 10th grade. That he could bring things like geology and timeline to me in ways that were authentic. You can't take me and drop me into the geologic timeline, but I can walk up on top of a hill, I can talk about landscape formation, and build a timeline along a student's body. I can take the authentic and I can make it concrete for them. I may not be able to show them a beaver out in the woods, but I can create them as the beaver. They can learn physical adaptations and the role that they play for that student by dressing them up, by creating role models, and by playing games. Systems education is classic. These girls are in a game they are migrating birds, and they're learning about the capacity of adults to take care of young through migration. That carbon cycle and climate change is a classic example where in that same room, the kids become carbon atoms and they move through the carbon cycle. And at the end of the game, they come up to me and they're just about slamming their fist on my chest because they're so darn frustrated because I kept getting stuck in the trees. That's the kind of authentic learning that people need, no matter what age you are, to learn at the end, where is carbon sequestered? Ah, I now understand. That to create role plays to make life real to them. That for climate change for us and for issues education, We do lots of work in forestry, mining, climate change, etc. Things that are kind of hot button, whoa, how do you deal with that kind of topic? That by taking weather and climate, most people in the world, most people in this country certainly don't understand the difference between weather and climate. And by removing the science from the issue and starting first with the science, we get students to understand things like weather is, what was it, 70 degrees today, that's weather. And here that may be relative to the climate, but that climate changes, and weather and the climate can change, weather changes quickly and routinely, and that climate simply is an average weather condition of a specific area. You got to have a little fun. That you've got to make some of that learning fun to help them understand what's going on. You can bring the reality to them. We have live animals that are non-releasable, that are injured typically, raptors, mammals, etc., that we can bring to the kids. Porcupines are a great example in Minnesota, where when I moved there 25 years ago where I lived, there was no porcupines, no skunks, no raccoons. Following the 90s, all three of which have now appeared. And that mammalian species, such as those three, are moving north with climate and warming that's going on. That, don't get me wrong, in that sense, if I'm conveying a little bit of, oh, it sounds kind of fluffy. It sounds like it's science, but it's all this sort of people component. I'm a huge advocate for hard science. I'm a biologist by training, and we bring that to our students. That it's simply making that connection and that application for them. These students are in a climate change class called Ecological Effects. They're using photography to document species at a specific time of year. So it might be May 15th, and go out and find a beaked hazel. I now have to learn to identify a beaked hazel. Take a photograph of that beaked hazel, come back, compare that to data, to that phenotype, and what is the norm? What is that new shifting baseline? Well, the buds are just opening on May 15th, and the average opening for buds that we have over 20-year history on that site is May 29th. What does that mean? That act, again, of trying to separate the science from the issue, but eventually you got to bring that issue in. You have to involve that people component. That climate change is the perfect example. And to bring the authentic to them, how in the world can a student understand an accumulation of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere? I can't see it. I can't really smell it. Maybe I can see the inversion in a haze that is a haze from an inversion that is occurring in a valley someplace. But for Minnesota kids, that doesn't really exist. And so take a balloon, inflate it to about 7 feet in diameter, and that's the equivalent of CO2 output from burning a gallon of gas in an unleaded car. And now put that context of how many balloons that means for a 100-watt bulb being on for the day. How many balloons can I reduce by recycling a small number of aluminum cans, or from a wind turbine that sits on a house? And how much does a building such as one of our classrooms, this happens to be 15,000 square feet, the Science Center, what is that in its heating demands in an environment that's quite warm? What does that create in greenhouse emissions to do something like that? That the other element, if you're going to start to prepare people to not only do science, but to make an environmental education, is to involve it into a community, which means pulling people together. You may remember the chaos that ensued if you were in a class of 30 students and the teacher gave the whole group direction and said, go. And typically what did they do? They divided you up into groups of 4 or 5. And that from groups of 4 or 5, now I can take what's learned here and I can start to move it out to a greater community. If you're an education person, I don't know, Bloom's taxonomy. Educators know about Bloom's taxonomy and its ways to question at higher levels. That to just be declarative knowledge about, do I know this is true? What does as a product of photosynthesis, what does a plant take in? What does a plant put out? Pretty low-level questioning, as opposed to a much more of a synthesis-based question or evaluation question that it has to allow me to create cause and effect relationships. That to do those sorts of manners where you can start to build that understanding and that interaction between people in small groups that can be brought into community. That as they can bring that information together, they can move that out then beyond them as society, which could be as a family. That in those groups that investigation, inquiry, inquiry-based learning, problem-solving learning, problem-based learning, there's all sorts of monikers that really fit to this that you may have heard of before. It's nothing particularly new. And yet, it is lacking in most science education and school programs throughout the country. Some teachers do it well, but we're not teaching teachers to do it. Families do it. Intergenerational learning occurs tremendously and often. You may be here because you have a family member that was hugely influential in what interested you in science. But if families are becoming more urbanized, we're also then losing that opportunity for society. That Wolfridge, on another level, has said a number of years ago that there's a lot of great formal setting educators, classroom teachers in classrooms, and yet there's also then all these people who are like Pete at Wolfridge that are non-formal setting learning. And then to help you understand with some jargon, that informal learning is the act of a place like a museum or displays that are more passive, where the learning experience really has to be guided by the participant or the student, where non-formal learning would be in an act of someone like me who's a teacher but not necessarily credentialed, nor in a formal setting classroom, a scoutmaster, a grandparent. Those could all be considered non-formal setting learnings opportunities. We created a school where the students, environmental ed school, that is a K through 6 school, has 330 enrollment, where the kids are going outside half a day a week. The teachers have to take them outside. It's a requirement of teaching in the school. The other element is that the teachers have to bring community members in for one time a week, every single week, to participate in the education process. And so you're holding them to a rule or a behavior that this is what you will do. Pretty tough changes, and yet hugely successful. There are a couple of researchers, I believe they're from Southern Illinois University, that Lieberman and Hoodie, Grace Lieberman, Trudy Hoodie, I can't remember exactly, that coined the term environment as an integrated context for learning. Environment is not the subject. Nature is not the subject. That environment is used for language arts, for science, for math, that they're taking Biltmore sticks to learn geometry, to gauge cords of wood in a tree from a height and a distance, Pythagorean's theorem to understand those measurements, and then what I can predict to be the height, I can take the circumference, I can do volume measurements. Perfect example of math skills integrated with the environment. That now as you take this, you say, okay, that's nice, but does it work? And that in our school, I wouldn't say that our students are the most stellar science performers in the state, but they're outperforming the local district and they're outperforming the state on average. There are other students that do better in science. But Lieberman and Hoodie found in the report related to EIC, Environment as Integrating Context, you could look this up, it's called Closing the Achievement Gap. And that's the executive summary in the report and the project that found that not only are they performing well, but of course now they're able to take that education and apply it much more aptly than people who simply were just coming out of science proper. That we need to build in those students that mutual benefit comes from mutual support, and that as we work together and that our communities learn these things, that will build a stronger future in society. I have a 17-year-old daughter who came home the other day and she had some friends with her. And the classic quote, I'd heard it only once before, she turned over and she said, "We're not friends on Facebook." She went, "Yeah?" She said, "Well, if we're not friends on Facebook, we can't be friends in real life." Think about how our community is changing and the lack of authenticism that is engaged with that. I'm on Facebook. Facebook's awesome. It's a great tool. But if I start to define that as my community or my network, that is hugely dangerous. And so that's where environmental ed, you saw things like climbing walls and students try to scale a flat wall of wood, that we need to teach students how to achieve collectively. We can't simply drop them at camp and assume that it occurs. We need to do not just what is learned, but how it's learned. That is possibly more important. If you ask corporate America, and they're out to hire somebody who's going to make them a lot of money, that they want creative ideas, but they want somebody who can work together. I can tell them what my product is. I can tell them what they need to know as far as knowledge. I need somebody that can achieve greatness by leadership, by pulling a community of people together, by pulling that group of that corporation together to achieve things. And it is often more important that they can do that than they have the facts behind them, that they need to be able to solve things that are apparently impossible or I can't do as an individual. But with the power of a community, a group behind me, I distinctly can. If you think about emergent behavior, that skill is crucial because I can't predict what the future will be. But I can predict and create people that are able to deal with that future no matter what it may be. Then you hear sometimes of, oh, Pete, what do you do? Oh, Wolfridge Environmental Learning Center. Oh, you're an environmentalist. I said, yeah, sure, I'm an environmentalist. And they make it sound like it's a religion. They make it sound like I have some following. And that perhaps, Wolfridge actually has been referred at times as a bit of a cult. And while they may be drinking the Kool-Aid, that you have to separate the fact from they may label it that way, but the act of being connected and able to problem solve relative to the environment is, in my opinion, one of the most crucial things we can do as a society. And people have to put away monikers and tags that they don't like because they have to prepare. This is basic survival class. I mentioned this earlier. There's nothing more emergent than this group of 7th grade boys. And you say, if you get a fire going and if you can melt snow, I'll bring cocoa for your hot water. And my gosh, the fighting and the battling. And they think it's a class in survival. I'm learning to survive. Give me a break. We're spending 2 hours out in the woods. You're not learning to survive. You are learning to work cooperatively. And we don't tell them that until the end of class when the teacher comes in and starts to debrief. Not what did you achieve. It's not important whether you got hot water. How did you achieve that? Was there a leader? Was there some person that was the fire person and somebody else that was a shelter person? Somebody was the idea person, somebody was the closer that brought it all together to make it happen. Those are the skills we need. And that those where the teachers come in. That authentic experience, whether putting them in it or bringing it to them, is camp, most definitely. But to bring a teacher into the mix and do now some reflection that they forced that issue. They forced the fact, a child out of that survival class might have figured out, oh, this is cool, divide and conquer. You did this, I did this, we achieved more effectively together. But that teacher is needed to help that process occur. The student may need time to process that and to give some think times and things like that. Some students, you may have heard theory of multiple intelligences. Heads nodding like crazy. That they may need time to write, where another one may need time to talk and interact and to provide those opportunities that that teacher forces that to occur. Another one may need kinesthetics, that I don't want to write it down, I don't want to read it, I want to go feel it and do it, and then I will remember. And that we build within that community the pieces to achieve. Those boys in that survival group, that they couldn't all strike the match. Somebody has to strike the match, and somebody has to keep tending the fire. The classic is, all right, okay, because we don't give them matches until, okay, tell us when you're ready, and we'll go bring the matches. And you get 10, but I'm going to only give you 3 to start. Oh, okay. And they come, they're screaming, we're ready, we're ready, we're ready. You come over, and they've got 3 sticks and a piece of birch bark. You say, all right, here you go. Woof, fire, dancing around, life is great, woof, gone. And they stare at each other. Well, now what? It's a great question. And that safe ways to fail, or perceptively fail, are just as important as the opportunities to succeed, because learning then becomes the element that is shared between the two. And that even for those teachers and those grad students that I have, that they need to understand those factors. We had our grad students who were leaving, and as they come back to us, and we 3-4 years later, like, hey, did you get a job? Are you kidding? Environmental ed's a tough field to get a job in. No, I didn't get a job, so I'm going off to get my teaching license. I'm going to go to a classroom. I get benefits. This is awesome. I get a salary. I've got stability. And that we heard that so often, we went to 14 colleges in the upper Midwest and said, send us your pre-service teachers. Anyone who's an education major going to get a teaching license knows that in pre-service, one of my final elements is a practicum. I have to go student teach. Got to make it real. Oh. But student teaching typically is 14, 15 weeks, perhaps. And you spend a few of those weeks sort of watching and kind of getting ready to go. And we said, send us your student teachers, and Britt here was one of them, and we're going to just drop them in and let them run. And they come and they spend a week to 2 weeks at most with us, and then you're in front of kids, and you're on, and you teach 4th graders in the afternoon and 8th graders and then the next morning, and then might be 11th graders the next morning. That suddenly that we're not the university who's providing that educational theory, but we're providing application of that theory. Those people got hired immediately out of school. They were out competing their peers who had gone through and been out possibly in the field with some jobs previous, but the principals, the school boards wanted teachers that can have real world skills. I want people who can help my kids achieve as a community. Declarative knowledge, this is a student in our high school credit program. In the summertime, there's a summer camp you can come to, but there's also a program where you can come and spend 4 weeks with us, and at the end of which you get a year of high school science credit. Anybody ever heard of the Concordia language villages in Minnesota? Total immersion language setting. What's the best way to learn language? Drop that person right in the midst of it. My daughter came home and said, she'd just come home from this, said, Dad, duh, Wolfridge should totally do this with ecology. So they do the same things. They have to do presentations, they create portfolios, there's rubrics and assessments and grading because they're getting high school credit for it. But declarative knowledge is the act of telling you what I've learned, where the act of now taking that and making it more than just declarative. I can tell you that I want at places like Wolfridge to, and the key that we're lacking is that emotional component, that engagement. As David Pines and Sean Carlson and Steve Hartzog and I have talked, we met with the Dean of the College of Education today, that the greatest problem across education platforms right now in the country in science is where we're focused, in our opinion, is lack of engagement. Engagement typically can also be called a lack of emotional connection or character building relative to the subject. There's all ways to look at it, but engagement is something that now creates memory and motivation. It's often linked to affective learning. People know what that is? These two boys are in an activity called chickadee landing. Go into a section of the forest with some conifers. The birds feel safer because they've got shelter nearby. Put seed out in the hands and a chickadee will come land in your hand. That's cool. Now you can tell that student all these factors about social behavior of chickadees, point out examples. They probably won't remember that. You put that chickadee landing on that person's hand, you saw that girl's face, they will remember that. That is engagement. That is emotional connection. Even for our teachers, the act of being immersed in lots of students repetitively over periods of times creates engagement for them, intensity of experience. You remember camp. You got dropped right into it. You didn't really get prepared. Your parents came, kicked you out of the car, and said, here you go, have fun. And you had to deal. And yet that intensity of that experience creates memory that helps you. Again, Richard Louv, the fellow who's identified and now speaking all over the country, that highlighting the fact that we're losing our children and their connections to nature, and all we need to do is to give them unstructured time to be out in the woods and discover things. That we structure them way too much, and we're worried about safety, and there may be an abduction, they might get Lyme's disease, all these different issues that cause concerns. We need to find whatever ways we can with society to get those kids into beautiful places and have them establish that connection. People say, oh, Pete, you're a naturalist, you must have been an education major. Nope. Science major? Yep. Why this field? As I think about it, my placement here where I am today has nothing to do with what I studied in high school or with what I studied in college. My My placement in this field is people took me out into beautiful places where I left going, my gosh, that was incredible. Stand on top of a mountain. I go into a section of beautiful woods. I go canoeing. I go skiing. That those acts are acts of values clarification. Our education system needs that sort of effort. I have kids that put out in there, they hate it. And that's just fine. But they need to have that opportunity because they're losing that opportunity. That they need to be out there to see things that they may not. These two boys are from downtown Minneapolis, the Phillips neighborhood, kind of one of the more hardcore sections of Minneapolis. They had never seen things like this before. And here's a point where people have, for the type of education we do, environmental ed can occur in nature centers that people have heard of on a daily basis. It could occur with a teacher, it could occur in lots of elements. Well, Pete, that's just 1 week. That's just students you drop in and you say, here you go, wow, wasn't that amazing? And it is powerful, even if it just remains as that week at Wolf Ridge, because the memory is so strong. And yet, what we do and what is crucial is that we work with teachers who have to choose the curriculum for their students. They have to describe to us, how do you prepare them? What are the goals and outcomes for the experience? Tell us what coursework has led up to this. Tell us how we'll use that. That active integration makes this even more valuable so that the emotions and beauty factors I find that develop my values are reinforced as well by integration into my academic curriculum. This is Spencer, and Spencer is in a class called Earthworks. Any artists in the room know of Andrew Goldsworthy? I see a couple heads nodding. Andrew Goldsworthy is known for his earthworks, or ephemeral works of art. The classic example is to draw a beautiful, wonderful design on a sandy beach right at water's edge. That work of art is not meant to last. It is an ephemeral piece that will soon disappear. That Spencer found a vertebrae from a deer, and this is his work of art. That we took this to create an unstructured structure, slight structure, and said, after an education with a bit of art and composition, said, go out and create these works of art. One of the very first classes, a principal was in attendance, and he came up and he tapped me and said, okay, this is nice, but what are we really going to do? Oh, this is it. What do you mean? No, but what are we going to do? You know, what's the outcome? What are we here to achieve? What are they learning? I said, they're learning about art, and they're discovering it for themselves. They couldn't conceive of it. And that's a bit of a problem. And we can change that. We can change that by conditioning that principle, by seeing how the student responds, to seeing how that changes their values. But you don't see that in graduation standards. That's a problem we need to fix. And that the other thing that's often questioned, we have high ropes courses, climbing walls, things like that. And they're like, well, yeah, that's nice, but how is that environmental education? Do you do like a canopy tour of different structural elements of a forest and the birds that live up here versus down here? And we did that for years because we thought we need to make the ropes course environmental. And environmental meant science. Environmental has science in it, but the teachers said, this is crucial to my students. Teachers get to choose. This is what I want them to do. I want you to put them 30 feet in the air, suspended on a wire that's only 3/8 inch in diameter. It's going to scare the you-know-what out of them. And yet, we know from those teachers, we know from parents coming back, parents that have literally come up to me just about grabbing me. This is the most important thing my student is going to do this year in school. You kind of go, wow, that's powerful. And that the act of learning intrapersonally has to begin before I can really do well interpersonally. And that acts of intensity in an experience will anchor the experience. The student that has to belay for another student. Many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with climbing walls. But on our climbing walls, the students belay for each other. Adults don't belay for them. And you have to manage that process, of course. But now, when that student gets their harness on and they turn around, they're truly trusting their life in their peers' hands. That's a powerful experience they will not forget. And that powerful experience then will anchor all of the rest of what they do. The parents that return tell us that. Well, I remember the ropes course, very, very quick, the first common thing. And you quiz them, what else? Well, I remember beaver ecology, and we found beaver chews, and we went orienteering, and we got totally lost. And they start going down the list. And that in the cases where schools didn't choose something such as this to provide intensity, the memory is not near as strong. Because that intensity helps that lifelong recall. You could argue the best education may be that which creates lifelong memory. Holy buckets, if you could remember everything you've ever done in class, wouldn't that be awesome? That's maybe not realistic, but intensity will help to manage that recall. So you've got authentic experience that's going to lead to a period of reflection, guided by a teacher, and the next step is connection. You have to provide something that not only emotionally inside them, but also outside them, can connect them to the world around them. Here's where history comes into play. It's difficult to say ultimately where we're going if we don't know where we've been, and to put them in the sense of social studies as an element of environmental education to understand cultural uses of the land, that fur trade and interactions of explorers with cultures, native peoples and how they lived upon the land and what their connections were. What can I learn from that, apply to my present day situation before I move on forward into future? That if I can embrace those concepts as a community and analyze them, I'll be more effective moving forward. Environmental ed in the US is different than any place in the rest of the world. Maybe I can't say, maybe not quite so broadly, but I visited with a woman at an international conference who had taken 27 different countries in the world and assessed what they do in environmental ed and why. We were the one anomaly. All 26 environmental ed was a remedial behavior related to some issue where people had screwed up. Erosion issues, safe water conditions, lack of biodiversity, whatever the case may be, typically related to human behaviors. The United States is unique in that we are still taking from concrete experiences and moving students into the abstract for the benefit simply of future societies, because this is the right thing to do. But we're now starting to bring issues to the forefront that are starting to make that environmental ed in the US a little bit more bonded with the rest of the world. That inquiry and that ability to think about where I've been and move it forward in a community is what we will have to do. And that we know from experiences with the rest of the world that they look to us, you know that, we know this, that many countries of the world, oh, we want to, if we can be more like the Americans, that's a good lifestyle, that'll be awesome. That we still are in that leadership position, whether we like it or not. And not exclusively, but certainly to great extents, that's the case. And this is a way that other countries are now looking to us. As they can move environmental ed past remedial behavior, can we extend it to the abstract so we can build better future generations for all of us? That we try whenever possible to build role modeling opportunities. We bring in people like fisheries managers. The DNR, and they've been out on Wolf Lake, which is a lake on the property, and they were going to do a fish population survey. Kids were invited to come down. The DNR guys had no idea what they just invited into their world. They're out on canoes in our lake, and we bring 20 kids out on the lake in canoes. It's chaos. It's awesome. I love it, but it's chaos. And they set gill nets out in the lake, and then they leave. Well, that's not all that exciting. The kids are kind of questioning what's going on. And the next day they come. Fisheries guys start pulling up the nets, pulling fish out, length, measurement, weight estimate, and then what? Anybody know? Slice open the air bladder, toss the fish overboard, and the kid looks. 19 more look. What'd you just do? Well, we were finished processing the fish, so now we're done and moving on to the next. We got 19 11-year-olds with their mouths agape. And the DNR guy's like, oh, what's the big deal? Huh? What? Huh? What do you mean? They process another fish over the side. One student starts to cry. He said, suddenly the DNR guys are just hit with a bevy, a barrage of kids all over them. What in the world are you doing? Well, this is what we do. We catch the fish in nets, we kill them, and then we toss them over the side and we slice their air bladder so they'll sink to the bottom. This is the process that's used to do a fish survey in this type of lake in this environment. The DNR could barely finish their survey that day because the kids pounded them for 2 hours on brainstorming ways that we can do this better. There must be a better way. That students have that ability. They can look thoughtfully and creatively at ways to get out and learn. We have to give them the opportunity to do so. We have to build that connection for them. We have to put past and present together for them before we can move them into the future. That concrete to abstract has to occur, and that connection from past to present has to occur. If you envision in a circle that authentic experience is up here, to reflection, to abstract, to future thinking, concrete and abstract connect, and that reflection or past component connects with that future component. If we're going to move them to the future, they have to have those experiences. They have to understand the impacts of decision making. They have to understand their connections to not only ecology, but now to issues, to economy. That students looking at a logging operation stand and stare. And you can imagine it can be kind of dramatic. And prior to going over there, we'd set the students up and we pulled out some 2x4s and some paneling and things like that, and we're quizzing them, where does this come from? 2x4 comes from Menards. True, okay. Where does Menards get it? Well, from a bigger Menards. And many kids at 11 years old don't know that a 2x4 comes from a tree. And they looked at us and said, well, you don't kill the tree, do you? No, we don't kill the tree. Those issues, that elements of research, this is doing peregrine falcon banding and doing blood sampling for DNA analysis, that the students need to be immersed in real research. They need to understand that process and have the tools. We run an acid rain monitoring station for Minnesota. We can't put the kids out onto the real equipment, but we get the MPCA, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to give us their sort of old equipment, and it looks exactly the same, that the kids can go gather samples from and can actually participate in that process. And that research element for kids, they will figure it out. And that begins with that basis to start to create that in an action component. Two professors, Hungerford and Volk, describe back in the 70s, this has been sort of a landmark environmental ed theory, that environmental education is an awareness to action continuum. Science education could end without the action component, and the action component comes in the process of environmental education, which implies choices. Well, she's representing 3. That's gasoline. And it just comes down to choices. It comes down to choices connected to industry, whether it's logging or mining, that essentially the easiest thing for most of us to understand is that supply and demand, that they will create what we will buy. That honestly is the simplest of connections for students, and that if you ask a student, do you recycle? A huge majority will raise their hand and say yes. So, well, that's nice, but do you finish the loop? Most folks don't understand the connection between recycling is great, but then to buy post-consumer recycled product is closing that loop. And that's a choice we have to make. And so, okay, all right, you're at Target, wherever it may be, you're going to buy your notebook come end of August, you're getting ready for school. Which one do you buy? Well, I'm going to buy the recycled paper one. All right. How much does that cost? I don't know. My parents get it. If you have to buy it, well, that one's $3.50, and the other notebook made from aspen trees is, say, $2. Oh, you see the shoulders drop. Well, my job isn't to tell them what the right decision to do is, but my job is to connect that loop for them and to put that together, that they can figure out that that is a connection. And then more inquiry will start to occur. What's the right thing to do? Do I need more information? That David asked me to include this, that what got Wolf Ridge and myself connected here to Davis was the fact that a number of years ago, teachers came to us, and which is often the case in driving our curriculum, and said, you got to help us out. I got kids coming in, I got parents coming in, and they want to know about climate change. There's no grad standard. I didn't get any of this in school. I read in the papers. I have no clue. We created a climate change awareness and action curriculum that can be used for teachers pre to Wolf Ridge. They can come up and take the authentic experience at Wolf Ridge, but it gives you here in 1 through 11 the perfect example of putting this all together. The very simple act of understanding at the beginning what is scientific method, and then working through a process and awareness that is understanding weather versus climate and carbon cycle and greenhouse effects, where in the carbon cycle it's the carbon journey. They become the carbon items. You give them mathematical graphs so you have them do interpretations and make predictions off of what will happen if current curves of emissions continue. Pretty easy math type of work. And then the second half really gets more into the action components. What are the impacts? How much energy do I use? What choices then do I have about that energy use? And finally, a community act to influence policy, politics come into play. And what do I choose to inform my political representatives of in a democratic society where the students then are provided the opportunity to write a letter to their senator? There is that entire loop, you might say, of an awareness to action or an awareness to action continuum. And that sounds complex, but it need not be very difficult. This is as simple as it may be, that if every light switch told you exactly how many watts was on it, you would likely look at those switches a bit differently and make your choices a bit differently. Simply, if I care, I pay attention before I flip the switch. And that those students just need to have that continual process then of learning simple ideas that not all electrical appliances are created equal. Turning on my radio for an hour is not the same as turning on my iPod, is not the same as turning on an electric little blower heater because I want to stay a little warmer while I sit and do my homework. And that the future really is dependent upon what choices we will make. And it's as simple as that, that groups of children are going to continue to function in some manner. It's just simply how we prepare them for that future. And that stewardship is a word often used in my industry, stewardship being the act of choosing my actions today with the concern and thought to those who will follow me, but I may never have contact with. I want to end you with a little bit more 70s music and some more pictures. We have 2,000 acres. But we use lots more than that. You know, Lake Superior, you saw sea kayaking out there. There's centers that are almost as big as we are that do the same thing on 80 acres. So it's not requisite, it's certainly a benefit. It's not requisite, yeah. Go ahead.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
Does Minnesota have a state environmental literacy plan?
It does.
So you have done one, and then how are your outdoor schools funded? Do you have a?
I didn't give you that part. I figured that was coming. Let me first address, because it's an interesting component in Minnesota with our environmental literacy plan. We have something called the Green Print. That is the name of our plan for environmental literacy in Minnesota. That is written, actually was written by the lead writer, was a former Wolf Ridge person, and that the state of Minnesota used to have something called the Office of Environmental Assistance, which is a government office that was to take care of that plan, write that plan, manage the delivery of the plan until budget cuts hit. And they closed the Office of Environmental Assistance, and it was, some people were laid off, and now it's under the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's an agency, correct. And that plan is written. That plan has been a model for several other states in the country, and yet the plan is not used by the state of Minnesota. That literacy plan takes all the different communities and the cross-sections of society and lays out conceptual goals with indicators for success of what do families need to know about the environment, what do business leaders need to know, what does the media need to know, what do faith communities need to know, and it's not being used. Of course, political administrations can change, and who knows what will come. The funding question, that Wolf Ridge is a large nonprofit. We have about 60 employees, depending on season, as many as 70. Our operating budget is about $2.7 million. Here's an astonishing thing. As a nonprofit, we are an earned income, typically about 88%, 90% earned income nonprofit. Of that, that means, think about that's well over $2 million that's earned, that schools don't pay for this out of operating budgets. They used to. When I arrived, they did. It was very common that a school district would, this is part of an expense of running a public school, that we take our kids up to Wolf Ridge. That ended by about the mid-late 90s. And now, every year, even through the worst of economic times, the communities, the kids themselves, parents, teachers, raise well over $3 million every single year to come, because they have to pay for transportation as well. They're driving from 4, 6, maybe 8 hours away. That's no small coin to bring 200 people, for example, in buses that way. And I never put that together until a number of years ago. I went, my God, that is amazing. That is stellar, that level of commitment exists in communities for our children. To put that together, there's a lot of fundraisers that would really love to sink into whatever emotion it is that makes that occur. And okay, I'd like to think we're part of it, but we're just the facilitators. It's the parents, it's the commitments of families and teachers that really make that occur. And we just simply get out of the way and provide an avenue for them to go. I do. That Minnesota's unique. One thing that makes Minnesota a bit unique that drove some of that literacy plan, in the state of Minnesota, there are 3 statutes in the state that address and require environmental education to be conducted. That's a wonderful sort of basis to lean on, but also, I don't know that drives it. It's the people of the state that drive it. And it's interesting because as we prepare and train environmental educators that go off across the country, they'll go off, they'll come back, and one of the things we've heard routinely is that just because your state has a populace that has a high environmental ethic, Colorado's a great example, Utah is a very good example. Most people across the country would say, as a group of people, the folks in Colorado tend to have high environmental ethic. Same thing with Utah, and yet their environmental education capacities and networks and structure in those states aren't near what other states are. Minnesota, Wisconsin tend to be very strong, and it's not until then you move out to both coasts. New York and the areas in the Northeast and New England area, pretty strong. down in North Carolina along that coast, some pretty strong infrastructure, a little bit in Florida, Oregon, California, Washington, all tremendously strong. But then it starts to dwindle a bit thereafter. Kentucky has a pretty good infrastructure as well of environmental education. Yeah.
Now, you might be interested to know about the Art Science Fusion program we have here at UC Davis.
I would love to.
We have a focus on environmental literacy, and we found that the students react really positively to this approach. In my class, which is called Earth, Water, Science Song, I give fairly conventional lectures on environmental science, and we have a couple of little field trips. But instead of taking a final exam, the students write and then produce a final musical in which they teach their audience what they've learned from the course. And we find that in terms of effective engagement, it seems to be very powerful.
You are creating authentic for them. It's beautiful. True. You're creating the avenue. Yes, way up back.
Sort of a two-part question regarding food and where this education experience translates. If there's a piece on the meal program that they're eating while they're staying there, is there sort of educational where your food comes from, reality, sort of like the 2x4 example you gave? And part B to that would be, is there also emphasis on foraging, fishing, beekeeping, these sort of experiences while they're out in the environmental experience?
The food issue first, that food waste, food education programs in the field of environmental ed are pretty common. I think it was 99 when we first added significant curricular efforts towards food education, again, driven by teachers. And what drove them was questions they were getting from their students about GMOs. That was as simple as that. They said, this isn't really in a grad standard. It kind of, sort of can be there, but I don't quite know how to deal with it. And you do that really well. Can you create a class? We created a class called Seeds of Change, where the connections really are to learn about genetic modification of organisms, why it's done, blows their mind with what actually is done, the issues of modification of seeds and the concern of society, what if all of the heirloom seeds were lost, and yet trying to bring that to them. We try very hard to provide non-advocacy based education and firmly believe that if you go on a political route of advocacy, you are going to lose your objectivity as an educator to supply value to your audiences across broad spectrums of society. And so we try to let them make those decisions and try to bring both sides of the issue. Look, there's a huge issue with feeding the growing populations of the world. That is a tremendous demand. You live right in the heart of it in Central Valley of California. We reference you routinely. routinely. And then also the other component for us that we hit very hard was the global aspect of supplying these food resources and the resources it takes to get green peppers from the Central Valley of California to northeastern Minnesota. And that's a choice we can make. We can as well make a choice to look at more local food production that can then eliminate or diminish some of that component. And so they have to calculate the environmental cost of Monday's lunch, which might have been a burger and fries kind of thing, and where did that really come from? We as an organization make commitments. We have lots of room we can improve on. One of our greatest ones is to commit to where our food comes from and go with a family-owned business that can document for us better than anyone in a large scale. We buy a lot of food, that all of our milk we know comes from within the state of Minnesota. We know about its history, its use of growth hormone and things like that. And yet, we also run our school as a free and reduced lunch program. And so if you're going to commit to financially supporting families who need help to this, it's our greatest scholarship effort, you might say. Well, free and reduced lunch program says that if you come to me as a student on a free lunch, I have to give you food on your plate whether you're going to eat it or not. That's a federal mandate as well as a state. And then we reduce their tuition costs. And so that makes it challenging for us to manage our food waste issues. Other centers, many across the country, have dumped that because it's wasteful, or it can be wasteful. we have chosen from a standpoint of supporting families and households to be able to do this, that this is an important aspect, then we simply need to work in educationally to try to get the kids to understand that. Our food waste issues aren't bad, but we can do better. The easiest thing would be if it truly was just a choice-based system. So you asked about food, I forget the second one now.
If also, in relation to that, if there's part of their outdoor experience is foraging, beekeeping, or sort of...
Not a lot. We do a little bit with fishing. With college students, we teach a hunting ethics class and the roles that hunting plays. We teach in fisheries management and wildlife management the population management tools that those aspects are to resource managers and what stocking serves for fish and predator or prey control for a white-tailed deer population, things like that. But there isn't much that we do in the way of foraging or beekeeping. Some centers do. We do maple syruping. Saw the woman drilling the hole into the tree. And so in our forest ecology class, for example, there's a component of learning the difference between consumptive and non-consumptive values for a natural resource. Shade is a non-consumptive value of a forest. Maple syrup is a consumptive value and yet doesn't have much impact. A 2x4, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
When you have this great number of kids who come in and you said you group them up, they do their activities together. Certainly some activities, some kids in these groups might have experienced it before. That's a lot of fun, one time. Do you take advantage of that at all to give?
If you look at we're unique across the country in that, and you can go to the website and I'll put it up here so you can note it as well. You can see in there dozens and dozens of lesson plans, and the entire body of the lesson plan isn't there, but the outline is, and the outcomes and the conceptual framework. And so a teacher can look at it and say, all right, if I'm going to take wildlife management class, I know what the grad standard is that my students will be addressing well in that class, what the concepts are, what the outcomes are. But at the beginning of every one of those lesson plans is the first component is assess your learner level. So have you rock climbed before? And then in the training program we provide, it's learning to use students, adults, that we built this model for mostly middle schoolers. We have some high school groups, some college groups. We're now getting early elementary. We're getting first and second graders that come for a week at a time. Whew. That's a whole other animal, let me tell you. They come with a 1-to-1 adult ratio. This is a huge community endeavor. This isn't just simply an act of the school. This is an act of the community. And so in that sense, that you're bringing people together that can share in that learning, both to help you bring what we already know here, because adults can help with that often, but then also to take it home. Does that answer the question?
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is if you have some segment, if you have a group that's not homogeneous in terms of their experience, would you, is there a policy as far as whether you kind of split them up, track them?
Sure.
Or whether you leave them together and maybe take more experienced kids and have them play as different roles?
I would say by far the most common is that they're not split up. You come, you bring 100 kids who are 6th graders, and we may divide you up into 6 groups, and then we tell you to place your students in those groups. Oftentimes, that's completely handled by the teacher. They, in turn, then get to choose how those groups will go, because they will choose often not only on learner level, perhaps, but on social interdynamics between kids in there, and so groups that will be successful. It's very common where we get groups that bring 4th, 5th, and 6th graders straight from a small school, and that the 4th graders will be in one group, the 5th graders in another group, 6th graders in another group. And yet, it's almost always up to the school to choose what you're talking about as far as a placement of our students. And yet, again, our greatest success is when what we do is part of what they do. And so it's fun because the schools that come in the fall, might come in middle of October, the fall is the best. I get to get my students, kind of set some tone and some framework for my year in my classroom, and we have this amazing experience that we reflect on the entire rest of the year. it starts us off with just this awesome beginning. No, the students that come in this class, schools in February, and the teachers, no, the winter is the best. We build up to it. We have this amazing experience, and then we cascade down from it, reflecting, no, May is the best. It's a beautiful thing, because if everyone thinks what they do, but it illustrates that it is up to the value of the teacher in the classroom to say, how does this fit for me? How will I use this? Am I going to use this as hardcore science? Am I going to intermix social studies, science, and interpersonal with climbing, some group team building sort of initiatives types work along with science? Or am I going to skip some of that and just do insect ecology, geology, stream ecology, things like that? The teachers make those choices, and yet we want them to make those choices, and yet they can make those informed choices by the fact of structured curriculum that they can look at and say, this will fit perfectly with what I'm doing in this week of the year, for example. Yeah.
The percent of Minnesota school kids that go through your system?
We have about 15,000 kids that come through our program. Those are grades all the way, as I mentioned, from first through high school. It used to be that sixth grade was the most common age. That has shifted to seventh, because when grad standards shifted, they took a lot of natural science out of fifth grade. In Minnesota, it moved to fifth and seventh. At one point, I can tell you that between Wolf Ridge, and there are 5 other centers like us in the state, approximately 12% of the sixth graders in the state went to a center like ours.
And would this be something that you do once in your school career, or do people
Depends on
come
the school.
multiple years?
We have numbers of schools that they come to us in fifth grade. They go to another center in sixth grade. They may take a field trip up to Winnipeg and do something else in seventh grade. The school that comes from Boston, Massachusetts, a very affluent school, ecology is their theme in sixth grade. And that, no, this is the school in Dallas. Ecology in sixth grade, so they come up to a very radically different environment. And yet in seventh grade, their theme is American history, and they go to Boston. And so lots of schools will have us as one element, but that element is part of an emergent experience in other contexts. Some schools come 3 years in a row to us. Again, it just is slightly dependent upon what they choose to do.
Do you have any students that come there on scholarship? And if so, how does that come?
We have private, foundational, as well as individual fundraising efforts that provide scholarships to schools. And so we give away tens of thousands of dollars a year that we go out and fundraise for. And typically a school would qualify by its level, its percentage of free and reduced in their school. That schools, this is becoming increasingly common due to demand. I can tell you of many districts where we charge, for example, per person. If you're bringing 85 people, we're going to give you a flat rate. This is how much per kid, per adult. Everyone has a bunk, they eat food, etc. But then the school may redistribute those amounts to say, well, we can't charge the teachers, so the kids are going to raise money for that. It's become increasingly common that the way they're scholarshipping some kids is they charge parents more than what kids are paying, telling them that we need your help, the demand is high, we know you want to come, please contribute by paying instead of $150, you're going to pay $200, and we're going to use that money to help out other students or families that may not have the ability to do so. Most schools, and this is incredibly common, say, don't let the finances be a problem. Come and talk to me and we'll figure out a way. They'll call us, they'll go to other teachers in the school, they'll go to corporate donors in the community, things like that. So much occurs outside of what I can tell you. I know that it occurs, but the details of what they do, I don't know. But I would tell you that we've had schools that have come every year since 1971. And so again, we routinely have parents, they themselves came as sixth graders. We've had schools that have come for 35 years. Their value is as high as it can get. And a school that stopped coming after 35 years had $18,000 in their Wolf Ridge slush fund that they used for things like scholarships or maybe some extra snacks or something like that. And they stopped coming. Obviously, finances aren't the issue. They had superfluous money. The increasing challenge that we're facing isn't so much finances and a motivated champion for the cause. Finances is something I can overcome. I can find the money. The challenge is more as teachers get pushed and pushed to do more with less, they get burdened and overwhelmed to a level where they say something's got to go. And to do a trip like this is a huge effort, huge. And yet the community values it. The school board does, the parents do, they're screaming at the school board, and the teachers are like, I can't do it. That's the greatest challenge against things like this occurring.
Yes, another question is, do you guys have multiple schools coming out every week, or is it just like one school?
This week there's six different schools there.
Do you mix them together like in different cabins or groups? Or
You saw a glimpse at the beginnings of the buildings. Environmental ed, especially on the West Coast, is classic sort of summer camp style. Big lodge looking down to the lake, boys' cabins to the right, girls to the left. And that when we built buildings in this facility, that from an environmental standpoint and impact, a footprint, it's much more efficient to put a lot of people in one building, maintain one envelope, one heating source, things like that. So that's what we did. So we have a 200-person dormitory and a 180-person dormitory. And yet within those dormitories, that this floor has this school, this wing has that school, this section over here has doors that close off that's separate from that school, and so that kind of distribution occurs. So that the places they will interact with other schools is in the dining hall, as they'll see that your school's at 6:05, mine's at 6:10, yours is at 6:15, so they're staggered that way, but they'll see each other in line. And then we do large group evening programs like live raptor programs, mammal programs, theatrical programs, and yet one school may be on this side of the auditorium, one school is in the middle, another one's over here. But as far as the classes out in the woods, they're just their folks. Yeah. A couple more and I'll stick around. Anything else? Thank you so very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to email me. I'd be glad to answer any questions. And if you're ever in northeastern Minnesota, stop on in. We'll take you around, show you around. Come on in January when it's about 20 below, and it's really fun. Yeah.
As you're leaving, I do have a question. How many of you would like to go visit Wolf Ridge? So go for it. Talk to Pete, see what you can work out. Maybe one of you would like to go teach there for a year. Why not? Thank you so very much.
That can yield lots of questions as we complete the evening. But to start off, rather than me telling you what I do or giving you that context, I want to show you what I do and give you that context. Chemistry and German,
and then quickly spent a year or so as an outdoor adventure guide, and could see that this was a pretty spectacular way of exploring the outdoors, but that unlike his fellow guides, he was pretty fascinated by what he was looking at, not just the experience of being out there in 30 below zero weather, zinging along on his snowshoes, or cutting holes in the ice to go ice fishing, or you name it, or exploring caves, which he was telling us about over dinner the other night. He found his way to the Wolf Ridge Environmental Learning Center, which is one of the oldest such centers in the US. They all came out of Earth Day in 1969, which is before I think any of you were born, or pretty nearly so. And Wolf Ridge, as you will learn from Pete, is really quite special. Not least because, as you will shortly hear, something like 500,000 kids have been part of the Wolf Ridge learning experience. So he has a lot to tell us about gateways to environmental education. Pete.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, and to Ralph, whom I've never met, nor the Dean, Winston. But it's a pleasure. When I left home a couple days ago, it was 2 degrees. That would be above zero, which is not a given at this time of year. And as he mentioned, it's winter camping. Just about 15 years ago, a couple of buddies and I were sitting around. Might have been a few beers involved, and we were watching the news, and the forecast was for February 6th. It was the evening, so very close to this time period. And the weather forecaster came on and said, "We're forecasting this will be the record lowest temperature ever in Minnesota this evening." And of course, what did we do? Turned to each other. We need to go camping. And so that evening, we trucked out into the woods, dug a pit in the snow, and we didn't experience the record cold. It was only minus 57 that night. It was a glorious evening. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was toasty warm and actually was late for work the next morning at Wolf Ridge as I had overslept. As David mentioned, I run a large nonprofit accredited school that is anything but formal, and that my interest in coming there from working as a mountain guide, but also being trained as a biologist, was to find the partnership between the two. I had no idea back in the 80s when I was completing college that what I was doing was likely a future that would someday be called a major in environmental studies, and now is one of the highest declared majors around the country for a lot of young people. That it's been a glorious ride for me, and so I'm here this evening to share what I feel is the need and the value of understanding emergent behavior, not so much for science particularly, but for humanity. And there is nothing more emergent than I will tell you later than putting a group of 7th grade boys together and telling them they need to start a fire and get hot water going or they will die. And that it is quite humorous, and it is a completely unpredictable sum of the whole as you begin to envision something like that. I will give you lots of images tonight, very few words on the screen. I hope I have a tremendous number of stories. Moving then, then you can adjust. Very good. Thank you, David.
Good evening. I'm David Pines. I am the co-organizer of Physics 150, Chemistry 298, Gateways to Emergent Behavior in Science and Society. And we, together with our Dean Winston Coe and our Provost Ralph Hexter, are sponsoring this series of distinguished lectures. Next week's lecturer will be Professor Sue Kiefer from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and she's going to talk, I've forgotten her exact title, but it's something like emergent, it's not quite emergent disasters, but it's quite close to that.
Stealth disasters.
Stealth disasters.
Stealth disasters.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of a
And
contradiction?
she's
I guess not.
a spectacularly good geologist, and she's thought hard about issues of natural storms, disasters, and looks at it from the long-time perspective of somebody who's studied the Earth as an emergent object some 3.5 billion years ago. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Pete Smerud with us. Pete has a not formal background, which is totally suitable for the director of a non-formal educational center, an environmental learning center. He began life as an undergraduate, majoring. When I was younger,